I've seen things that don't belong in this world, things that defy reason, bend reality, whisper truths that shouldn't be known. That's the nature of the work at G.R.I.C. We don't chase ghosts or hunt monsters. We contain Rends, tears in the fabric of what we understand. Some are places, some are objects, some are things that look back when you look at them. That night, the air was thick with something I couldn't name. A weight settled in my chest the moment I stepped into the briefing room. I wasn't alone in feeling it. The others were tense, shifting in their seats, their eyes flicking between one another. No one spoke. We were all waiting for the supervisor to begin. The screen at the front of the room flickered to life and a grainy video played. Security footage dark and distorted. An alleyway, dimly lit by a flickering street lamp. At first, nothing. Then a shadow, deeper than the surrounding darkness, moved along the brick wall. It was like watching ink spill and crawl across the surface. A man entered the frame, walking briskly until he stopped. His head tilted slightly, as if he heard something. Then his entire body tensed, his breath visible in the cold air. I didn't need the grainy audio to know the moment the Ephimere whispered to him. His posture shattered. He stumbled back, his mouth open, face pale, eyes wide with something beyond fear. He turned and ran. The footage cut out. No one spoke. We all knew what we had seen, even if none of us understood it. The supervisor stepped forward. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it, something wary. This is your target. Class 4, Rend. Designation, Ephimere. He let the word hang in the air. None of us moved. None of us asked questions. We knew better than that. The supervisor's eyes swept the room, gauging our reactions. He knew we wouldn't ask questions, not yet. Not when we were still processing what we had seen. The image of the man in the footage was burned into my mind. Whatever the Ephimere had whispered to him, it had been enough to break him. The supervisor continued. The Ephimere does not deceive. It does not manipulate. It speaks only what will happen. That alone was enough to make my stomach turn. I'd dealt with plenty of Rends before, but nothing like this. Nothing that could see ahead. We relied on control, on containment, on understanding. But how do you fight something that already knows your next move? The supervisor tapped the screen and a new image appeared, the astral shroud. I had heard whispers about it before, nothing concrete. No one knew exactly where G.R.I.C had found it, or how long it had been locked away. But now, for the first time, we were looking at it. A flowing mass of pure black, shifting as if breathing, like a veil caught in an unseen wind. Even in a still image, it felt alive. The astral shroud is a Class 4 Rend in our possession, the supervisor explained. We believe it can contain the Ephimere, but it must be attuned first. He gestured toward a steel case on the table. Another operative stepped forward, unclasped the latches and lifted the lid. Inside, folded neatly within, was the shroud. It was darker than the void. I could feel it. An absence of light, an absence of sound. The moment the case was opened, the air around us felt thicker. I swallowed hard. The attunement process must be done precisely, the supervisor continued. Each of you will inscribe the sigils under the next waning moon. If done correctly, the shroud will act as a living net, constricting around the Ephimere and binding it within its folds. If done incorrectly, he didn't finish the sentence, he didn't need to. I exhaled slowly, watching the fabric ripple within the case. We were being asked to use an untested Rend to capture another, and something deep inside me whispered that we were not ready. I wanted to look away from the shroud, but I couldn't. Something about it pulled at me, like staring into a depthless pit, your mind desperate to find the bottom but knowing there isn't one. One of the operatives beside me, Renner, shifted uncomfortably. And if it doesn't work? His voice was steady, but his fingers drummed against the table, betraying his nerves. The supervisor's expression didn't change. Then we will have a much bigger problem. That was the only answer we were going to get. The screen changed again. this time showing a map overlay of the city. A red-marked area flickered near the industrial district. The Ephimere has been appearing here, the supervisor continued. 3 confirmed sightings in the past week. It doesn't linger in one place for long, but it always returns. We believe it is waiting for something. Waiting. The word sat heavy in my chest. What makes you think it'll show tonight? I asked. The supervisor turned toward me, his expression unreadable. Because it already has. He tapped the screen. The timestamp on the surveillance footage was from an hour ago. The Ephimere was here. Now a silence settled over the room. No one spoke. We didn't need to. The mission had already started. The supervisor closed the case, sealing the astral shroud inside. You deploy in 1 hour. Attune the shroud before then. I clenched my jaw. No preparation, no testing, no second chances. We were stepping into the unknown, armed with something just as unpredictable. And if the Ephimere had already seen the outcome, then it already knew whether we would fail. We left the briefing room in silence. There was nothing to say, no reassurances, no bravado. We all knew the weight of what we were walking into. The Ephimere was already ahead of us. It had seen the future. It knew what we would do before we did it. That thought alone made my skin crawl. The attunement process took place in a secured chamber beneath the facility, a cold, windowless space lit only by dim overhead fluorescence. The astral shroud lay stretched across a steel table, its surface shifting subtly, as if responding to our presence. Renner and I took our positions. Each of us held a silver-tipped quill, the ink a mixture of crushed moonstone and something the supervisor hadn't explained. We didn't ask. The sigils had to be perfect. Each stroke mattered. I traced the first symbol onto the fabric, my hand steady despite the way my stomach churned. As soon as the ink touched the shroud, the sigil pulsed just once, before sinking into the darkness like a ripple vanishing into still water. I exhaled slowly and continued. Time passed in weighted silence, one sigil, then another, each one binding the shroud more tightly to its purpose. My mind drifted, the quiet allowing unwanted thoughts to creep in. What would the Ephimere whisper to me if I heard it? What did it know about my future? I clenched my jaw and focused. One last symbol, one last mark. I pressed the quill to the fabric, finishing the final stroke. The moment the last sigil vanished into the shroud, the entire room seemed to inhale. The lights flickered. A strange, low vibration hummed through the air. It was done. The shroud was ready. I only hoped we were. The hum in the air faded, but the unease it left behind remained. The shroud had accepted the attunement, but something about the way it moved now, subtler, more controlled, made my skin prickle. It wasn't just fabric anymore. It was watching. Renner let out a slow breath. I hate this thing. I didn't disagree. We packed the shroud carefully into a reinforced containment case, securing the latches before we moved out. The facility's underground corridors swallowed our footsteps as we made our way toward the armory, where the rest of the team was waiting. The others were already geared up, tactical suits, suppressors on their sidearms. Not that bullets would do anything to a Rend like this. The real weapon was the case Renner held at his side. The supervisor stood near the exit, arms crossed. Your transport is waiting. Get in, deploy, and secure the target. Once the Ephimere is contained, you return immediately. No deviations. His eyes flicked to me. Understood? I nodded. No deviations. That was the plan. But plans never survived contact with Rends. As we stepped outside, the night air hit me like a wall, cold and dense, thick with the weight of something unseen. The city stretched ahead, quiet, waiting. The Ephimere was out there, and it already knew we were coming. The transport ride was silent. No one spoke, but we all felt it, that gnawing sense of unease crawling beneath our skin. The Ephimere had already seen this. Every second that passed, I wondered if we were following a path it had laid out for us. Renner sat across from me, his grip tight on the containment case. The shroud was still, but its presence was felt, like it was listening, waiting. Through the reinforced windows, the city blurred past, neon lights smearing against the darkness. We were heading toward the industrial district. Abandoned buildings, forgotten structures, places where things could hide in the shadows unnoticed. A crackle in my earpiece broke the silence. ETA 2 minutes? TA 2. I flexed my fingers, my gloves creaking against my knuckles. No deviations, that's what the supervisor had said. But deviating wasn't always a choice. Sometimes the mission changed before you had a chance to react. The transport slowed. The street ahead was empty, quiet in a way that felt unnatural. "This is it," Renner muttered. The doors hissed open and the cold night air rushed in. We stepped out, boots crunching against wet pavement. The air felt wrong, heavy, electric, like something was watching. I scanned the darkened alleyways, my pulse steady but my muscles tight. We had the shroud, we had the plan. But the Ephimere had the future. And that meant it had the advantage. The city was never this quiet. Even in the dead of night, there was always something. The distant hum of traffic, the echo of footsteps in alleyways, the occasional murmur of conversation. But here, in this forgotten part of the industrial district, the silence was absolute. It wasn't normal. It wasn't right. Renner shifted beside me, his breathing slow, controlled. The others spread out, moving into position. No sudden movements, no unnecessary noise. We had one objective: find the Ephimere, deploy the shroud, contain it. I took a step forward, my boots brushing against scattered debris. The buildings around us loomed high, skeletal remains of abandoned industry, their windows shattered, their walls scarred with decay. And then, a whisper. It wasn't a voice. Not really. More like a breath against the edges of my mind, curling just beneath my thoughts. Renner inhaled sharply. He'd felt it too. The Ephimere was here. I tightened my grip on my sidearm, knowing it was useless but needing the weight of it anyway. My earpiece crackled. Movement, northwest corner. I turned my head, my eyes locking onto the far end of the alley. A shadow pooled unnaturally at the base of a rusted fire escape, a darkness that didn't belong. It shifted. Not with the wind, not with the light, with intention. The air went cold. Renner unlatched the case, his hand steady despite the way his jaw clenched. The shroud was ready. But so was the Ephimere. The Ephimere moved. Not like a living thing, but like a ripple spreading across the fabric of reality itself. A darkness deeper than the absence of light, bleeding upward, stretching along the brick wall like ink soaking into paper. Renner exhaled slowly and pulled the shroud from the case. The fabric unfurled, shifting in a way that made my mind recoil. It didn't just move, it reacted, sensing what was about to happen before it did. The sigils we had inscribed earlier glowed faintly, silver etchings shimmering like constellations across the inky fabric. It was ready. But was I? The Ephimere had stopped moving. It lingered, watching us without eyes. It didn't need them. A whisper brushed against my mind. Not words, not yet. Just the feeling of something about to be said. I clenched my jaw. No distractions, no deviations. I took a step forward, the shroud draped between my gloved hands. It felt heavier than before, as if the weight of the future itself had been woven into its threads. Renner mirrored me, his stance measured, controlled. The others held their positions, weapons raised, not to fire but to give the illusion of control. We had one chance. I locked eyes with the shifting void in front of me. And then, the Ephimere whispered, not aloud, not in sound, but inside me. A single, undeniable truth. You will fail. I felt my pulse stutter. The shroud rippled in my grip, sensing the hesitation, the fracture in my certainty. And the Ephimere, it moved. The Ephimere surged and the world twisted. It wasn't like a physical movement, not something I could track with my eyes. It was like space itself shifted, bending around it as if reality wasn't solid anymore. One moment it was against the brick wall. The next it was closer, too close. The whisper still echoed in my mind. You will fail. I gritted my teeth, shoving the words aside. That's what it wanted. Doubt, hesitation. Those were the real weapons. The shroud stirred in my hands, sensing the moment. The sigils along its surface pulsed in response, waiting for me to act. I did. I moved fast, sweeping the shroud forward, its inky mass rippling through the air. It shouldn't have had weight, but it did. It pulled as if something on the other side was holding on to it. The Ephimere didn't retreat. It didn't dodge. It let me move, like it knew exactly what I would do, because it did. The second the shroud touched the edge of its form, the whisper changed. I have already seen the end. A shudder ran through me, cold and final. But I didn't stop. I threw the shroud outward, letting it unfurl like liquid night. It wrapped around the Ephimere, swallowing its shifting void into itself. For a moment, everything was still. Then the shroud convulsed. The air around us bent inward, like the entire alley had just taken a breath. A deep, unnatural inhale. My ears rang with a sound I couldn't hear, like something pressing against my skull from the inside. The Ephimere was fighting. Renner took a step back, his face pale. The shroud buckled, the sigils flickered, and then the whisper came back, but this time it wasn't just in my head, it was everywhere. You were too late. The moment the whisper filled the air, the world seemed to crack. Not physically, not in a way I could see, but I felt it. Like the fabric of reality itself had been strained too far, and something underneath had begun to give. The shroud writhed in my grip, its sigils dimming, flickering erratically. The Ephimere wasn't just resisting. It was unraveling the containment itself, twisting it apart from the inside. Renner's breath hitched. It's breaking loose. No, I didn't let it. I forced the shroud tighter, pulling it around the Ephimere like a vice. The fabric twisted, dark tendrils snapping inward, constricting around the shifting void beneath. The sigils reignited, burning silver hot against the black. For the first time, the Ephimere hesitated. The whisper changed. You do not understand. I didn't care. I took another step forward, reinforcing the grip, pressing the shroud into itself, folding the entity into its impossible depths. The weight in the air grew heavier, pressing against my skull, my chest, my thoughts. The Ephimere wasn't just resisting containment. It was trying to show me something. Images flickered at the edges of my mind, fractured glimpses of something I should not see. Buildings collapsing, fire consuming the sky, a figure standing in the wreckage, holding something that pulsed with power. And then, a reflection. Not in glass, not in water, but in me. My own face staring back at me, cracked down the center like shattered porcelain. The whisper returned, softer now, resigned. You were never meant to stop this. And then, with one final shudder, the shroud sealed shut. The Ephimere was contained, but its final words would not leave me. The alley was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from absence, but the kind that lingers after something has been ripped away. A hollow, unnatural stillness. The Ephimere was gone, or rather, trapped. The shroud had wrapped itself completely, folding into something smaller, tighter, like a void compressed into fabric. The sigils along its surface still glowed, but faintly, like embers dying out after a fire. Renner let out a breath he must have been holding for too long. We got it, he muttered. But he didn't sound relieved. Neither was I, because the whisper hadn't left. It wasn't speaking anymore, but its words, "You were never meant to stop this," echoed in the back of my mind like a splinter buried too deep to remove. I exhaled sharply, trying to shake it off. "Secure it," I ordered, stepping back. Renner nodded, though his movements were careful, too careful. He didn't want to touch the shroud more than he had to. None of us did. The others moved in, their footsteps hesitant, their faces unreadable. Even with the mission complete, no one celebrated. We weren't fools. We had captured something that saw the future, which meant it had led us. The thought made my skin crawl. I turned my attention back to the city, scanning the rooftops, the alleyways, the endless dark corners where things could hide. Everything looked the same, nothing had changed. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that we had already lost. We just didn't know it yet. The ride back to the facility was suffocating. No one spoke. No one even moved more than necessary. The containment case sat secured in the center of the transport, locked down with reinforced restraints. But even sealed away, the shroud felt present. It wasn't shifting anymore. It wasn't fighting. It was waiting. Renner sat across from me, his arms crossed, his gaze locked on the case like he expected it to move. His jaw was tight, the same unspoken question weighing on him that weighed on me. Had we actually won? Or had we done exactly what the Ephimere had wanted? The supervisor's voice crackled in over comms. Report. I took a slow breath before answering. Target secured. The shroud held. A pause, then quieter. But it spoke. Silence. Then, what did it say? I hesitated. Saying it aloud made it real, but I wasn't about to lie. You were never meant to stop this. Another pause. This one longer. The supervisor's voice, when it finally returned, was unreadable. Understood. Proceed to debriefing upon arrival. The line went dead. I exchanged a glance with Renner. He looked like he wanted to say something, but didn't. The transport rumbled on, cutting through the city streets. The lights outside blurred past, bright against the darkness, familiar and unchanged. And yet, for the first time in my life, I felt like I was looking at something that had already ended. Like the future wasn't waiting for us. Like it had already happened. The facility loomed ahead, a monolith of steel and shadow against the night sky. No markings, no identifiers, just another building that no one noticed, because they weren't meant to. We pulled into the underground entry bay, the reinforced doors sealing shut behind us with a hiss of pressurized air. The moment the transport stopped, 2 containment specialists were already waiting, clad in protective gear, their movements precise and methodical. They didn't ask questions, they didn't hesitate, they just took the case and left, disappearing down the secured corridor that led to the lower levels, the restricted floors. We weren't cleared to follow. I wasn't sure I wanted to. Renner exhaled, running a hand down his face. I need a drink. I didn't respond. My thoughts were still tangled, replaying the moment the Ephimere had spoken, the images it had forced into my mind. I had seen things I wasn't meant to see. And the worst part? They weren't warnings, they were certainties. I pushed the thought down and stepped out of the transport. The supervisor was already waiting at the debriefing station, standing with his usual unreadable expression. Walk with me, he said. It wasn't a request. I fell in step beside him as he led me down the corridor. The walls here were smooth, pristine, too clean, too controlled. As if the facility itself was trying to convince us that nothing unnatural existed within it. The supervisor spoke without looking at me. You did well. The words felt hollow. He knew it. I knew it. We contained it, I said carefully. That doesn't mean we stopped anything. A beat of silence. Then, no, he admitted. It doesn't. That was the moment I knew. Whatever the Ephimere had seen, whatever it knew, G.R.I.C already suspected it. And they weren't trying to prevent it, they were preparing for it. The supervisor led me through a corridor I had never walked before. That alone put me on edge. There were places in this facility that even seasoned operatives like me had no clearance to enter. Tonight, that had changed. The door at the end of the hall required biometric access. The supervisor placed his palm against the scanner, and a faint hum filled the air as the locks disengaged. The door slid open, revealing a chamber bathed in cold, sterile light. Inside, mirrored walls. My stomach tightened. I knew what that meant. This was where they were keeping the shroud. The Ephimere. Reflections weaken the binding. That's why mirrored containment was necessary. But being near it? That was something else entirely. The supervisor stepped inside, expecting me to follow. I did. The room was silent except for the faint hum of monitoring equipment. In the center, suspended within a field of energy, was the containment case, the same one we had loaded onto the transport. Only now, the shroud was moving inside it. Barely, subtle, almost imperceptible. But it was shifting, slow, deliberate, like something breathing in its sleep. I swallowed hard. Why am I here? The supervisor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the case. You made contact with it, he said. Not a question, a fact. It spoke to you directly. I exhaled sharply, my pulse steady, but my mind racing. You already know what it said. Yes. He turned to face me then, his expression unreadable. And I need to know exactly what it showed you. That stopped me cold, not what it said, what it showed me. I hadn't told anyone about the visions, the fire, the collapse, the figure in the wreckage. My own reflection shattered like glass. But the supervisor knew something, which meant G.R.I.C had been expecting this all along. And that terrified me more than the Ephimere ever could. I stared at the supervisor, my pulse a slow, steady beat against the inside of my skull. He was watching me carefully, waiting, measuring my reaction. I could lie. I could tell him that the Ephimere had only whispered, that it had tried to shake me, that it had failed. But I had spent too many years working for G.R.I.C to believe that would work. They already knew. I exhaled slowly. I saw something, I admitted. Images, fragments, the city burning. A collapse. Someone standing in the wreckage, holding something wrong. I didn't say what else I saw. I didn't say that I had seen myself. The supervisor nodded, as if this confirmed something. You weren't the only one. I felt the words before I fully understood them. A slow, creeping realization crawling up my spine. I took a step closer. What do you mean? He glanced toward the containment case where the shroud stirred faintly, pressing against the inside of its prison like something testing the strength of a door. Everyone who has encountered a Class 4 Rend of this nature, he said carefully, has seen something. My mouth felt dry. And? His gaze shifted back to me. And the visions always come true. The words settled in my mind like a weight dropping into deep water. I wanted to deny it, to argue, but I knew. G.R.I.C didn't just find anomalies, they used them. And now, whatever was coming, whatever the Ephimere had whispered about, was something they had already started planning for. I had thought we were trying to stop something, but I wasn't sure that was true anymore. A slow, hollow feeling settled in my chest. The supervisor had said it so plainly, like it was a fact, a law of nature. The visions always come true. My mind reeled back to the things I had seen, the city in flames, the collapse, the figure in the wreckage. My reflection, broken. I had assumed it was a warning, a glimpse of something to prevent. But G.R.I.C wasn't interested in stopping it. They were preparing for it. I took another step toward the containment case, staring at the shroud as it pulsed faintly against the glass. The Ephimere was inside, but it wasn't struggling anymore. It was waiting, because it already knew what was going to happen. I turned back to the supervisor. My voice was steady, but something deep inside me felt like it was fracturing. When? He didn't ask what I meant, he just held my gaze and said, soon. A cold certainty settled over me. The Ephimere had whispered, you were never meant to stop this. And now I understood. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. G.R.I.C hadn't captured the Ephimere to prevent the future. They had done it to control it. And I had helped them. I looked at the containment case one last time, at the shifting darkness within, and felt something stir in the depths of my mind. A whisper, faint but certain. You have already chosen your side. The mirrored walls around me reflected my face back at me. I wasn't sure I recognized it anymore.